Well, I see we have a great lineup tonight. To introduce myself, I'm David Andelman, a former president of the Overseas Press Club, and welcome to our Overseas Press Club of America book night. Tonight with Jim Laurie, author of The Last Helicopter, Two Lives in Indochina. Just one little hint, until you're called on in the Q&A session, please do keep yourself muted so we can hear all of our amazing guests and everything he has to say and offer. Jim Laurie was a friend back to my earliest days in Cambodia on my first foreign assignment for the New York Times. I was just a young tot, about 30 years old. Jim was by then quite a seasoned NBC News correspondent, but I remember him as a kind colleague to someone very much a neophyte, me, and even stayed long enough to be evacuated on the last American choppers out of Phnom Penh. I'd left the week before on the last fixed wing relief flight out of there to Bangkok. Now, thanks to his amazing new book, I found out just why he was shuttling back and forth between Phnom Penh and Saigon. And we meet a whole cast of compelling figures, especially one young Cambodian lady to whom Jim lost his heart and nearly his life. In the interim, he spent decades reporting across the world, but especially Asia, first for NBC, then for decades with ABC News, surviving all sorts of wars, revolutions, and the stuff that TV news is made of. But now, praise the Lord, he's with us all to tell us all about it. So I'll turn it over to Jim, sequestered in his vast acreage in rural Maine, where he can pick up the story. Jim.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Thank you very much, David. And thanks to the OPC for having me here today. I just wish we would do this in person. I could have those drinks that are much promised by the OPC. That would be great. This is obviously for all of us an extraordinary year. It's the first year that I can recall that I have not had at least part of the year traveling overseas. On this day last year, I was in Hai Phong, Vietnam, making my way through the country, down the coast, down south, and then across into Cambodia. And all that happened after I had spent 2.5 months in China. So it's very unusual for me to be, if you will, grounded, and very much grounded I am up here in rural Maine, but it's a great place to be. The weather's been good, and so I'm happy at least that we're all here and we're able to connect in this fashion. The book that David has alluded to is obviously a very personal memoir. In part, it's the story of a young reporter trying to find his way in a first-time war situation. I was much greener, I think, than David was when I arrived at age 22 in Cambodia. I really had just coming out of school, out of Asia studies, and I wanted to go off and see Asia. And so a lot of this book is about coming of age, if you will, in Southeast Asia. But a bigger part of it really is a tribute to a very special woman who I met in June of 1970. The story of Sok Sinan is one that I felt was very much worth preserving. And I had this obsession, which goes back more than 30 years, with sort of trying to uncover what is it about this universal and timeless question of survival? Why do, under extraordinary, horrible conditions, some people survive and some do not? It came home to me also 30 years ago when I first went to Poland and visited Auschwitz and talked to a marvelous man who was a survivor of Auschwitz. And we talked about the issues of survival. Is it purely luck? Is it something else? Is it youth? And so all of these issues went into my desire to tell this tale, to tell this story of Cambodia in the early 1970s. I also wanted to try to, if I could, preserve for younger readers and students of history a first-person sense of time and place, Cambodia and Vietnam in this extraordinary period that I witnessed between 1970 and 1980. And maybe to give you a better sense of that time, I'd like to share with you a little video that I have assembled. And it just gives you a more visual sense, obviously, of what it was like in those days. When I look back at this film, which I shot, much of it 50 years ago, I marvel how crisp and clear the video that we have today is. We now have clear HD and high res. I'm going to take you back now to an era of low res and SD, a very blurry and shaky world, which was the world that we lived in 50 years ago in Cambodia and Vietnam. So I'm going to try this technology here. Bear with me while I press things like share screen and we try to go to the video. Stand by. The first thing I want to say is that the year is 1970. I'm going to lose, I think, this box here so you can pay more attention to the video itself. The year is 1970. And just to put this in context, President Nixon on April the 30th had announced a military offensive into Cambodia, which followed the overthrow of Norodom Sihanouk, who had ruled Cambodia since independence from the French in 1953. About 90,000 troops plunged across the border from Vietnam. Most of them were South Vietnamese under the command of a man who I met named Do Cao Tri, but 30 or 40,000 of them were US troops. And this was a time of my first taste of war as a combat reporter, the greenest combat reporter, I'm sure, in Cambodia, Vietnam at the time in that theater. And the incursions were the first war stories I had ever covered. So this was the beginning. And then just a short time later in June, I drove from Saigon to Phnom Penh for my first glimpse of the Cambodian capital. But my first experience was this, not a city at war at all. The city that I encountered was mostly peaceful, had an almost innocent quality about it. So far spared of war, the people I met seemed remarkably detached, and the young woman that captivated me introduced me to Khmer culture, to Khmer ballet, and other aspects of Cambodian society. The first signs of war in the city were the slow but steady buildup of war refugees fleeing North Vietnamese occupation, increasing combat, and widespread bombing. In 1970, when I arrived, Phnom Penh was a sleepy city of about 700,000 people. By early 1975, it had swollen to 1.8 million people. Within a few days in 1975, the Khmer Rouge reduced it from 1.8 million to 100,000, again, within 4 days. The woman who introduced me to all of this and who sort of kept me going back and forth between Saigon and Phnom Penh was a middle-class, remarkably independent woman employed by a French agricultural firm, the daughter of a military commander in Sihanouk's army. And she was a person that was very easy to fall in love with. And as a 22-year-old, she was 21. It was pretty much love at first sight. We had less than a year together as I was drawn back to cover the war in Vietnam, got a job with NBC, and then left the region by 1973. And yet we maintained a connection over all those years. When I returned to Phnom Penh in early 1975, it was very much a different city from that which I had left in 1972. War had finally reached the city. Every day it was subjected to rocket attacks. It was being kept alive, and I think, David, you remember this, by daily American C-130 food and ammunition flights coming in from Thailand.
Vividly, and when
Khmer
Rouge wasn't,
yes.
in fact, wasn't bombing the airport, rocketing the airport.
Exactly. The country, of course, had been massively bombed. The bombing stopped in 1973 by an act of Congress, but over the period of time, there were more than 113,000 targets bombed by more than 2.5 million tons of bombs. And this had an impact, not so much an impact, interestingly, on the death toll in Cambodia, but more of an impact on the psychology. The Khmer Rouge being able to use this bombing as an instrument of propaganda to mobilize its army and, with the help of the Vietnamese, be able to build itself for their eventual victory. After 73 bombing halt, the combat went on for 2.5 years. the young Khmer military commanders who I met, the smiles disappeared as they realized by 1975 that there was very little hope in terms of a military victory. Much of the middle class, however, seemed to take a fatalistic view of the prospects of a communist victory. My friend Soxinan, she had remained in Cambodia despite numerous opportunities to leave. And I promised, if I left Cambodia, if the end came, that I would take her with me. And then the day of April the 12th came along, something called Operation Eagle Pull.
Word that the U.S. was pulling out of Cambodia came early Saturday morning. American Marines were flown in from the USS aircraft carriers Okinawa and Hancock to carry out the helicopter lift. A school several blocks from the embassy served as the makeshift landing zone.
And as I got in the helicopter, I took my little 8mm film camera and put it up to the window to see the skyline of Phnom Penh, the pagodas disappearing beneath me as we choppered out to the USS Okinawa in the Gulf of Thailand. And most distressing, of course, was that the woman that I wanted to get out did not get out. She had failed to make the last helicopter, and she began a remarkable and terrifying struggle to survive the Khmer Rouge rule and the infamous killing fields. I moved on at that point to Vietnam, and I arrived just about 4 days before the final collapse of Saigon. This is a scene, by the way, a picture that I took from the Caravelle Hotel, which if any of you have been to Saigon, it's one that you will recognize immediately. Now, if I'm going to use my cursor here, and if you can see, these buildings over here have all been torn down today. They've been replaced by new modern shopping centers and apartment buildings. But the old Continental Palace Hotel is there. This was the open cafeteria, if you will, the bar, what we call the Continental Shelf. This building over to the right here is the old French Opera House, which during the South Vietnamese time was the headquarters for the National Assembly. It's now been returned to an opera house. And for those of you who are interested in the way the war was covered, this was sort of the center of war coverage in Saigon. It was 2 blocks from where the military briefings were held. The New York Times office, David, was right around here. Can you see my cursor there? And this is the New York Times. This is the Eden Building, NBC, the Associated Press, all of the major news agencies that were not housed in the Caravelle Hotel were housed there and had been there since the early 60s. And now we're up to 1975. I went into Vietnam with a man who I had come out of Cambodia with, a man who I'm very grateful for, a man named Neil Davis, one of the great wartime camera people, an Australian who had covered Vietnam and Cambodia going all the way back to 1963. And we sort of had a agreement. Under no conditions would we do another helicopter evacuation. We would stay in Vietnam and find out what the victory, which was inevitable, of the communists was going to be like. And we resolved not to evacuate. I think that most of us are familiar with what happened next, the incredible evacuation of Vietnam. You have, within that final month of April 1975, 130,000 people departing before the collapse of South Vietnam. More than 6,000 by helicopter from Tan Son Nhut Air Base and the U.S. Embassy, including the embassy helipad, 6,000 within 48 hours in Operation Frequent Wind, and many more thousand going down the Saigon River and by boat and being rescued by the U.S. 7th Fleet in the South China Sea. I was behind, and I was down at the bottom of the U.S. Embassy building watching the very last helicopter leave the embassy roof on the morning of April 30th. Helicopter carrying the last U.S. Marines. North Vietnamese troops and tanks were already entering the city. I took these pictures a few hours later from the Caravelle Hotel as the tanks headed down to the waterfront and fanned out across the city.
NBC News correspondent Jim Laurie is one of the few Americans still left in Saigon, in the city when President Duong Van Minh went on the radio and told the Viet Cong that his country would surrender unconditionally and that he had told its army to lay down its arms. Here from Saigon Radio Hookup is Laurie's report on the surrender.
In the words of General Minh, we are here to hand over the power of government to you in order to avoid bloodshed.
I remained in Saigon for 25 days as the communists set up their new regime and tightened their control. In the back of my mind, I thought there might be ways that Sok Sanan could make it to Vietnam. Several thousand Khmer had fled across the Vietnamese border from eastern Cambodia. Well, so much for my little sampler of a remarkable time 40 to 50 years ago. The book goes on to tell my story of how I eventually managed to get Sanan out of Cambodia, and we managed to get her to America in 1980. So there you have a little sampler, David, of what I was doing all those years ago, and I'm happy to discuss anything that you guys would like to discuss regarding the book, about Vietnam, Cambodia history, or anything in between.
Well, great, Jim. That's just terrific.